thank you all for joining. Take a minute to find your seats. You don't even have to. You could stand up and move around as long as you stop talking, which you've done. So thank you. My name is Adam. I always forget to do that part. So my name is Adam. I am one of the many volunteer organizers for OWASP Ottawa. And every month we bring this meetup here to you with the help of some other fantastic folks, including the University of Ottawa, with the IBM Cyber Range upstairs. Rewind helps bring us the pizza. So thank you to Greg and the Rewind crew for that. But the reality is that events like this don't happen without a community. Open source projects don't happen without a community. So if you are an OWASP Ottawa volunteer, can you put your hand up? These are the folks. You've seen their names on a slide as well. Thank you for all that you do. And if you see them, please thank them. Why don't we give everybody a round of applause? If you would like to become one of us, we would very much welcome that. Many hands make light work. Find anybody who just put their hand up, or you can find us on our OWASP website. That's owasp.org/Ottawa. Yes? I've been doing this for a little over a year, and I've just gotten that part right. And I didn't have to get it tattooed, right? You can also find us on the internet if you can't make it here in person. And some folks are joining us on our YouTube channel, either right now or at some point in the future time. So thanks for joining us here. We have some new faces. How many people here have not been here before? I have. All right, that's, again, almost a third of the room. I am super curious. I don't know which body parts we're going to use to do this, but if you found us on Meetup, put up your hand. Okay. If you found us through the OWASP website, put up your hand. Okay. If you found us on LinkedIn, put up your hand. Nobody. Microsoft. Is there any other unique way that you found us? Word of mouth. How about you? Really? Amazing. What was your prompt? Okay, there we go. So we've made it. The AI algorithms have scraped our page enough to know that this is a great place to be on a Wednesday night, the third Wednesday of every month here in Ottawa. We're pretty excited to have Micah here with us this evening, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Micah in a moment, but there are a couple of more things that I would like to mention, but I don't entirely remember what they were. Was there anything super important? I guess there weren't a couple of more things. So then I will talk about Micah. If you pronounce it OSINT, put up your right hand. If you pronounce it OSINT, put up your left hand. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, put up both hands. Well, Micah is on the other end of that spectrum, and it's a roundabout way how I originally found out about Micah. But if you want to know about how to find out about someone or find someone, this might be the guy you want to talk to. I'm going to let him tell us a little bit more about him in detail, but the reality is he has spent many years learning about and delivering in the world of open source intelligence from a tooling perspective, from an approach perspective, and currently does some really exciting design work around that. So I'm mostly going to keep my mouth shut at this point so that my battery doesn't run out, and let you hear all about open source intelligence from Micah. Round of applause.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me. Wait for the slides to figure themselves out there. Okay. Magic of technology. Okay. Wicked. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It's a pretty funny story about how this came about, involving an osteopath and my brother-in-law and a lot of other confusing things, who happen to be the same person. Anyway, it was great to be invited and great attendance. Really nice to be here. I'm not going to belabor too much in terms of biography or anything like that, but let me just step through what we're going to do this evening. 3 things I'd like to talk about. first of all, what does it even mean to be a professional open source intelligence person in 2025? That's changed a lot. Secondly, thinking about open source intelligence not just as a collection discipline or an investigative discipline, but as an analytical discipline. And then thirdly, I'll give you some tips and tricks in terms of how to just do the trade more effectively from a practical standpoint that involve 3 C's. So hold on to your seats. There's 3 C's coming. This is the braggy part of the presentation. These are some of the places I've worked over the years. I've been doing OSINT related stuff for about 13 years, I guess. These are some of the fancy organizations that I've worked with, lots in the US, some in the UK, now pretty well exclusively in Canada for both geopolitical and just personal reasons. I've chosen to focus my attention here. I'm also a gardener and a big woodworker, so craft and growing things is very, very important to me. And I always make an absolute requirement that I include my dogs in every presentation so that if you don't like me, at least you like my dogs. This is Cooper. About a week ago, he showed up for class photos, sitting next to me on the couch. So I said, well, I got to take a picture of you. Google's telling me I'm running out of space on my phone. And this is his big sister, Saskia. And they spend a lot of time on the back of the couch yelling at things. So kind of the best thing in my life. So there you go. I want to talk a little bit about what the heck got me into open source intelligence and why I have what my particular angle on open source intelligence is. And since we're all kind of in a nerdy environment, I figured you wouldn't mind if I nerded out a little bit. My undergraduate was in history and philosophy of all things, and I got really into a guy named Hans-Georg Gadamer. That's Hans-Georg over there. He's part of a school of philosophy called existential phenomenological psychology, which is pretty interesting. Existential, what does it all mean to be here? Phenomenology, how do we experience phenomena in our world? And psychology, what does that tell us about ourselves, right? So this relationship between the experience of interacting with phenomena in the world and what that does to who we think we are and how we fit into the universe, light stuff, became very, very important to me. And so, as he says, my real concern wasn't as philosophic, not what we do or what we ought to do, but what happens to us over and above our wanting and doing. Like when we go out and do OSINT, or when we do research, or when we walk out the door any day, the interest is as much about how that impacts who we are as it is what we learn from it. And so I've, over time, transitioned that through my career as a historical researcher originally, and sitting at Library and Archives Canada out at the edge of town and just digging through boxes of paper, into the open source intelligence world and graduate studies in intelligence and national security. And now I'm both run my own company and am a professor or a lecturer in intelligence and national security at Carleton. Ooh, sorry. Thank you for having me. So there you go. So just a little bit of my nerd credentials there. Transitioning that over to the open source intelligence world, I've gotten very, very interested in this idea of information behavior. When we as humans interact with information, it does crazy things to us. And it changes how we think about these things, much like Gadamer told us it would. And so information behavior is a whole set of different studies and information seeking patterns and this kind of stuff, the ways that we interact with it. A related concept is information anxiety, right? We've all probably had this feeling before. It's a sense of guilt that there's so much information out in the world and we're just one person. We have no idea how to navigate all of that information. It freaks us out, right? And so you can see a lot of the things that are happening in our world right now, even if you want to take it in a lot of different directions. You could look at politics as really a symptom. A lot of the politics in the world right now is a symptom of information anxiety. We have all of this information available to us at our fingertips. What part of it matters to me? What part of it matters to everyone else? And out of that information anxiety, you end up with things called information pathologies, right? So pathology is this process of identifying what's like broken with people. And information pathologies are a lot of the things that we all know of: misinformation and disinformation and malinformation, and the weird Facebook posts that your mom keeps sharing on Facebook, all of these bizarre things that we encounter. And so you can imagine that has real relevance to open source intelligence. It occurs to me that I haven't really defined open source intelligence yet. But really, open source intelligence is an intelligence discipline in the context that I think about it, and I'll get into this a little bit more, that uses publicly available information anybody can get, to make assessments about a particular situation to enable someone to make a decision. So really, open source intelligence and all intelligence disciplines, their marker of success is whether or not they enable someone to make an important decision, fundamentally. As it relates to information, really the core question is, how do we make meaning of infinite volumes of information without going batshit crazy? And in a lot of ways, that's my approach to open source intelligence. How do we do this in a way that doesn't completely ruin us? And so I've created a company in 2021 called Decision Space. Again, decisions really are at the heart of that. And we do three things. It's all design related. So we do design technology, specifically around user experience. One of the problems that we have with the open source intelligence software world is that most of the software sucks really badly. Not just because it's very powerful and sometimes it can do really remarkable computational things, but actually interacting with the software is horrible. And the last thing you want is an intelligence analyst who's having to make a really, really important assessment who's pissed off while they're doing it, right? None of us thinks clearly when we're angry. And so the first thing we do is help to design software that actually works well for an intelligence analyst. Secondly, I do a lot of policy design and policy development, usually with public sector or institutions, intelligence agencies, to help them figure out how to do open source intelligence within a traditional intelligence world, which is surprisingly difficult, actually. And then thirdly, I work a lot with folks in terms of training, tradecraft development to figure out open source intelligence methods. And this spans everything from, finding a particular person in a particular place and doing that with a very high level of detail, which is one end of the spectrum, to helping somebody to understand what public views about the royalty are in Azerbaijan or something like this, right? Everything in between, figuring out good methods that you can use to do that. So a big part of that from the software world, because again, knowing your all's background, I've coined this concept called analytical user experience, which is basically a form of user experience that really focuses on helping people make good sense of the information that's in front of them in the context of intelligence. And so the idea is that we build tools that people actually want to use, tools that broaden their thinking instead of narrowing it, drive their analytical momentum instead of sapping it. We've all had that experience of getting partway through a process in a piece of software and just wanting to crawl under our desk and cry, right? And so a big part of it is creating software that actually moves people through it quickly and gives them a sense of control and agency. But finally, really tools that work the way that an analyst thinks, which is pretty hard to do. But when you understand how analysts think, which we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about tonight, it's a lot easier. Okay, cool. That's the introductory part. So the three things we're going to cover tonight: what does it look like to be a professional in OSINT? How do we balance structure and intuition as it relates to open source intelligence analysis? And then thirdly, some tips and tricks in terms of just structure for how you can actually achieve good outcomes with open source without burning yourself out or going batshit crazy. So to start with, what does it look like to be a professional in OSINT today? First thing is that there's constant changes to data access. So it used to be 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that pretty well any social media, for example, you could easily access that data. Some of you probably know the Cambridge Analytica scandal, right? The thing people don't really realize is that everything they did was completely within the terms of service of Facebook at the time. It was the Wild West. It was extraordinary. There were all these little cool little plugins that you could add to Facebook to just rip data out of Facebook. It was beautiful. And it was a very different world, right? We had a very different set of limits. That's changed a lot. Now you can't really even get a hold of Twitter data without having an account or without paying a tremendous amount of money, and they are very, very careful about how they give you that data. A big part of why that is, not all of it, but a big part of that is evolving expectations around privacy and publicness, right? So without getting really into the law, which you end up having to, there's a real difference between what someone has their own subjective expectation of privacy and what an objectively reasonable expectation of privacy is. Those are two very different things. So each of us probably has a slightly different appreciation or understanding of how our privacy works on the internet. As that changes, it changes across society, and it changes how we do the work that we do. But thirdly, there's definitely a high demand, and I'm experiencing this right now, for clearer authorities and capabilities around what we can actually do. If you're in government and you need to use open source information and you want to basically access to the public information world, getting the right authorities, knowing what you can and cannot do is very, very critical. Okay, so from a technology standpoint, there's been a lot of development. I was sort of there at the forging of the One Ring in 2013 when we started to build a lot of these tools. Huge explosion of tool markets for the PAI, or publicly available information OSINT world. Massive billions of dollars that have been spent in that world. A lot of venture capital money has had really perverse effects on the industry. All the same, that started to level off. Less investment, but also a lot of consolidation within the tool market. There's huge proliferation of homebrewed solutions. So as the other open source community who are joining us tonight Very, very common. Open source intelligence tools that are open source in terms of code are pretty common. Some of them are better than others. A lot of them break all the time, but we've all lived that. And then thirdly, certainly from a technology standpoint, the role of generative AI can easily be overstated, but is a very, very important part of the OSINT world, as it is pretty much in any part of the sort of modern industry. It's a bit like the printing press. Like, you can kind of poo-poo the printing press for a while, but at a certain point it becomes important. I put an asterisk after it just because it's always less transformational than you might think it is. And certainly from a user experience standpoint, figuring out how to integrate AI capabilities well in a piece of software for the purposes of intelligence is tricky business. But it's happening, and it's pretty exciting. Okay, and then in methods, the government's getting better and better at using OSINT. That may be good or bad news for you, depending on how you look at it. But more and more, they're catching up to the rest of the community, which is good. A really big growth in the public practitioner community happening as well. Certainly since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, 2022. Anyway, massive amounts of, Slava Ukraini. Massive growth of individuals just going on the internet and kind of doing OSINT, which is good. Sometimes bad, but sometimes good. But there's fundamentally a real crisis of sustainability. That's why we're talking about sustainable OSINT tonight. What do I mean by a crisis of sustainability? Bunch of different levels. So when we think about sustainability, it's the ability to maintain or support a process continuously over time, right? Making this thing actually work for the long haul. This occurs at every level you can imagine. So as you can imagine based on where we started, at the cognitive level, it's really hard to do this without going crazy. Methodologically, figuring out a good, sound, structured, predictable way to do it, explainable way to do it is important. Organizationally, figuring out how to kind of draw the right line and work up to that line, finding the right people in the right places. And then societally, crucially, it's also very difficult to do that, figuring out how to navigate and negotiate the appropriate boundaries for this kind of work. Okay, so cognitively, one of the most important distinctions that I think it really helps to clarify a lot of things when we think about how knowledge works is the distinction between a puzzle and a mystery. How many of you like to do puzzles, Sudokus, crosswords, right? There's something magical about when you get to the end of the puzzle and you solve the puzzle. There's a solution, right? It's called cognitive closure, and I don't think it's appropriate to compare it to the thing I want to compare it to, but it's really a good feeling that we often have when we finish a puzzle, right? And it's just a satisfying experience. Mysteries are a little bit different, right? Mysteries are a thing where, it's about the future. We'll see conditional probabilities of what could or couldn't happen, different scenarios of what could come to pass, right? It's a much more difficult thing to pin down. You don't get that same sort of closure. And so one of the tricks that's started to happen a lot in the open source intelligence community is that against the backdrop of that information anxiety, against the backdrop of all this infinite amount of information, people have started to focus more and more on just fact-based OSINT. Just give me the answer. I want to do OSINT that involves a conclusion. And if it's about finding a person, I want to find everything about them and know everything about them, and that's it. Because I get the cognitive closure. I get to solve the puzzle. Great feeling. That's really cool, but it's not intelligence work. Intelligence work is about the future. And there's not really a whole lot of facts about the future. It's about conditional probabilities, about what could happen. Right? And so there's a really important distinction there, and it requires a lot more judgment. So one intelligence scholar says, Sarah Logan says, intelligence analysis entails delivering judgments rather than facts. It's not just about fact finding. Or to be more colorful, Jennifer Sims, who's probably, I have a huge academic crush on Jennifer Sims. She says, a man surprised by a bear will not be saved by knowing the precise length of the animal's incisors, right? It's not just about facts, it's about judgment. And one of the difficulties cognitively is that we need to get past just trying to find facts in OSINT. We actually need to think about how we help other people to make good decisions in conditions of uncertainty. That's actually the more difficult cognitive issue. Similarly, we have a bit of an identity crisis when we think methodologically. Between, as I said, the folks that are sort of open source practitioners who are out on the internet and just sort of doing this kind of work, doing geoguessing. Anybody who ever watched a geoguessing video? They're fascinating, they're magical. It's interesting, and I love to watch the little cognitive processes that are happening in the course of it. But again, the goal is to get it right, and that's not always the thing that you can actually do. And so Ben Conklin says one of the specific challenges with OSINT is that anybody with a web browser can say that they're an OSINT analyst. So how can you define a professional discipline that anyone can claim to be a part of? It's a very, very difficult thing for those of us who consider ourselves not just sort of OSINT hobbyists, but OSINT professionals. So methodologically, there's a pretty significant issue there. From a sort of OSINT universe standpoint and from an organizational standpoint, the intelligence community, folks like CSIS and CSE and others, don't always understand how open source works, really, fundamentally. They're getting better. And then open source practitioners generally don't understand how intelligence works. They don't really know how those two things work. It's kind of parallel universes between the two. And often when I'm working with maybe a government department or something like this, or a university sometimes, to help them understand how to do open source intelligence, figuring out how to bridge that divide, I kind of sit in this weird boundary area between the two, is a lot of the work that I do. Final thing at the societal level is really about responsibility, ethics, and public trust. So if you're in intelligence, you are required to maintain the public trust. In fact, you need public trust in order to do your job. You can't do your job without it. OSINT creates a potential challenge there if the particular approaches that you're taking are too invasive, inappropriate, come to the wrong conclusions, help people make bad decisions. You're eroding public trust. And if you erode public trust, it's less and less sustainable. It's less and less possible to do this. So it would be my contention that actually OSINTers need to be stewards of the information environment. It's a bit like thinking about sustainable forestry, for example. I grew up in the US. My entire family were big hunters, and they were all rabid Republicans, but they were all environmentalists because they appreciated that if I want to go out in the forest and shoot something tasty, I need to make sure that those tasty things are in the forest, and not just now, but for my grandkids. Right? And so I think actually OSINT needs to think something similarly around the information environment. We can all go be fancy hunters and kind of do our Elmer Fudd thing on the internet. But if in the process we're destroying the very thing that we need to continue doing the thing that we're doing, we're not doing it very well. And so I think actually stewardship is a nice way to think about it. Okay, so bottom line. OSINT professionals are part of the information environment. We all know this. We all experience information anxiety. Not surprising. OSINT professionals need analytical judgment, not just collection prowess, not just the ability to find that little tiny piece of information. That's very helpful, but that little piece of information is going to end up in other places all over the internet, and that's really not the only thing you need. You really need the judgment piece of it. But importantly, and the good news in a lot of ways, is that good analytical judgment is a trainable skill. It's a thing that you can get better at. We have a tendency to think people are smart and dumb. The truth is, dumb people can get smart. Smart people can get dumb too. But analytical judgment is a thing that you can get better at, and that's a lot of what I do. All right, so let's talk about how you can actually go about getting better at analytical judgment. I'd argue, really, it's a fine balance between structure and intuition. It's between the ability to create a frame for how you're going to do something, and then allow yourself within the boundaries of what you're doing, and the boundaries of the plan that you've created, to be creative, to let your intuition kind of push you along in things, because actually that's the most powerful part of our brain. Has anybody ever heard of a guy named Daniel Kahneman? Yeah, a few people. Okay, he wrote a book, probably his magnum opus. He died about a year ago, called Thinking Fast and Slow. And in Thinking Fast and Slow, Kahneman basically argues that our brain's made up of two different systems, System 1 and System 2. 95% of the time, our brain is using System 1. It's the part of our brain that when you're on the highway and you decide to change lanes, does all of the things you need to do about looking over your shoulder and turning on your turn signal and making sure you don't drive into somebody. You're not thinking about those things consciously. You might be arguing with your partner or listening to the radio. Those are just autopilot things that we do. They're cognitive activities, but we're not thinking about them, right? They're just sort of there. They're happening. It's the automatic pilot part of our brain. Only 5% of our brain is really focused on the System 2, this rational reasoning part of our brain. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of calories, so you're welcome. You're burning some calories while you listen to this talk. It's slow. It's very logical, but interestingly, it's very lazy. So I don't know if you've had this experience. I have it about 100 times a day. I'm sitting at my computer trying to get something done, and my System 1 is saying, come play. Stop working. This is boring. And that's part of the balance that we have to strike. But the interesting thing is that Kahneman actually says, this is exactly how it's supposed to be. This is why we still exist as a species, is that most of the time, our brain's on autopilot, and we let our brain do the decision-making in autopilot for us, right? So there's a balance between the two. The way that starts to become really practical in terms of intelligence analysis is something called heuristics. A heuristic is just a cognitive shortcut that our brain uses to simplify decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. Sounds familiar, right? We've been using a lot of those words. We're on a university campus. I'm sure there's plenty of these. In urban design, they call them desire paths. You have a perfectly good sidewalk right there, and they just walked right across the lawn. That's a heuristic, right? That's us. That's a rule of thumb. Whatever, I can get there faster doing it this way. And the reality is that heuristics are not optional. Heuristics are just how we evolved. They're the thing that actually allows us to be human. But then a heuristic that you don't pay attention to becomes a bias, becomes a prejudice, and it becomes a misleading sort of blind spot. Heuristics that you're aware of and that you're conscious of, you can take your system one and pay attention, or you take your system two and pay attention to, become really powerful because you're able to make decisions more quickly. That's that part of balancing structure and intuition. The difficulty is with a lot of this stuff is that we bring all these weird metaphors. Language is just this, as another philosopher calls it, a mobile army of metaphors, right? Every piece of language is basically just a metaphor. So we bring these metaphors, we use them to describe things. And one of the metaphors that always gets used in open source intelligence is needles in haystacks, right? Oh, we got to find the needle in the haystack. We got to connect the dots, whatever. I'm more and more convinced after all these years, there are no needles to be found. There's just a lot of hay of varying sharpness, and it's about figuring out the part of it that's relevant to you. Again, it's about these kind of the more conditional, mysterious part of this, not just about the facts. And so paying attention to that is very, very important. Setting the bar for what good looks like is really important when we start to think about it in the context of heuristics. The other interesting metaphor is sort of a story, but it becomes really relevant to open source intelligence, is that, again, an unexamined heuristic becomes a bias. And one of the most common biases that we have is what's called availability bias. We generally will take the thing that is most available to us. So there's an old story, a very, very old story, about a guy walking down the street. He sees this guy wandering around under a streetlight looking for something. He says, "Can I help you?" "Oh, yeah, I lost my keys." And so they look around, they're looking for his keys on the ground, and the guy looks at him after a few minutes, goes, "Are you sure you lost them here?" He said, No, I lost them down the street, but the light's really good here." And that's a very, very common thing in information seeking, and certainly in open source intelligence. We look where we think we can find the thing most easily rather than where the thing might actually exist. And again, these are these heuristics. So we have all of these ideas for how the brain actually works, how we actually think of one. Let me give you one that's a lot more helpful. We often talk about connecting the dots in intelligence. It's this idea that we have that somehow all of the dots relevant to a particular case exist out there. We just need to find the connections between them. 9/11, when it happened, the 9/11 Commission said, well, it was a failure of imagination. They just didn't connect the dots. A lot of my intelligence analyst friends scream and cuss when people say that, because the reality is, particularly in intelligence context, the dots are coming at you and they want to kill you. Like, it's not just about connecting dots. It's actually what's called mosaic thinking. So it's about placing each of these pieces of information in a place, reordering it, reorganizing it, and then slowly but surely, as more and more of these pieces come together, the mosaic, that actual picture that comes out of it, starts to come together. That's actually what intelligence analysis usually looks like. Okay, so let me give you 3 skills to focus on this a little bit more. The first one's collaboration. None of us is really particularly capable of doing this work on our own. We have this image in our heads a lot of the time of like OSINTers who have like a hoodie in the computers, you know, like the cyber hack, like the hacker guy, you know, it's like the Matrix or something. It's not actually how it works. You want to know how professional intelligence analysts do it? They do it together. Very, very rarely do they do it by themselves. So Nada Bakos, who was one of the lethal ladies, they called them, that was one of the women responsible for the bin Laden raid, taking down Osama bin Laden, said that, you know, more often than not, effective intelligence is the result of sustained collective efforts that spark moments of intuition among a pool of experts and processes, not individual hunches that compel monumental effort. If you want to do good intelligence work, find other people, find other system twos to work with together, because you're never going to have the right perspective by yourself. So first skill is collaboration. Speaking of the bin Laden raid, this is a good example of how this works. So from about 2001 to about 2005, they said the CIA in particular, as they're trying to find bin Laden, was doing what they themselves called Elvis sighting. So someone would call and say, "Hey, I think I saw bin Laden." And then they would send a team of people to go try and find bin Laden. They'd capture somebody, and the first thing they would ask him, no joke, was, "Where's bin Laden?" As if some random dude. Like, I'm not even kidding. It's tragic, but it's really how it was. It was terrible. It was completely useless. So in 2005, an analyst, female analyst at the CIA, writes what's called the Inroads Memo. She says, okay, this is ridiculous. If we're going to find bin Laden, we're going to need to organize ourselves around some different ways and structures that we might be able to find him. First, she said, he likes to do media appearances. So maybe there's things in his media appearances that we can use to be able to establish a little bit more clearly where he is. Secondly, there's all these other leaders in Al-Qaeda, right? There's all these other people that are a lot more visible than this guy is, particularly the number 3 in Al-Qaeda, the director of operations. Whew, you do not want to be that guy. He got killed like 7 times. But there's lots of them, and maybe we can figure out from them how we can get back to him. Thirdly, he's got a huge family. The bin Laden family is gigantic. Maybe we can figure out through his family connections where he is. And then finally, she said, maybe because he's not communicating with anyone else, there must be couriers. There must be people who are actually literally bringing him things. And ultimately, that was the thing that they figured out. They found a courier network. They tracked it for multiple years. They found this house in Abbottabad, Pakistan, and the rest is history. Peter Bergen, who wrote a book all about this called Manhunt, talks about these 4 pillars becoming the grid through which CIA analysts would, from now on, sift all intelligence that had been gathered, but also then inform the collection of new intelligence. This is a very critical thing. This is this structure intuition point I was making. If you can structure your analysis and say, okay, these are my 4 hypotheses. These are my 4 kind of core hunches for how this thing's going to go down. When new information comes in, I need to basically take that and compare this to this heuristic. I need to say, okay, this is my heuristic. What does this new information tell me about whether this has changed at all? And how can I then use this information to do something new with it? That's the essence of intelligence. Again, collaborative endeavor. Second skill to think about in terms of analytical thinking, tactical patience. Pete Blaber, who's a special operations legend, talks about this concept called developing the situation, which is literally letting time pass rather than rushing through things. He says it's a process of actively building context, recognizing patterns, discovering options, and mastering the future as it unfolds in front of you. When in doubt, develop the situation. It's a good phrase to get. I should get a tattoo of that, actually, because it's really just this process of being careful about not jumping to conclusions too quickly. To make this a lot more nerdy, anybody know who Thomas Bayes is? You guys are programmers. You guys know Bayesian logic. Yeah, I love Thomas Bayes. That's Thomas Bayes. He was a minister. One day he was at a fair and he saw some people having a card game and betting on the card game, and he looked at it and said, I wonder how they decide how much to bet. And he started paying more and more attention to this and realized that as the card game went on, they got more information. Those of you who are talking about puzzles will know that the more parts of the crossword you fill in, the better your overall knowledge of that crossword becomes, and the higher the probability is that you're going to guess the right thing. So Bayes starts paying attention to this, and he realizes that actually thinking is this progressive, accumulative thing. That as we get more information, our minds change, and that's a good thing. So remembering what informs your assessment, your priors, what's my prior assessment of the situation is really important. And then being prepared to update that expectation when you get new information is really important. It's a feature, not a bug. This is a thing that we actually do really well. Changing your mind is always a good thing. Generally is always an indication of intelligence. So yeah, Bayes is my boy. All right, so one of the most important things that Bayes pointed out as it relates to how we reason is something called base rate neglect. Anybody ever heard of base rate neglect? Okay. So let's say, I'll give you an example. You're walking across campus and you see these 2 guys walking across campus and you say hello. And they say, oh yeah, we're graduate students. How many of you think that they are graduate students in math? How many of you think they're graduate students in business? Math? Yeah, pretty good number. How about business? Okay, what if I told you that there are like 12 times more business majors than there are math majors doing their doctorates at U Ottawa? The base rate has a huge influence on what your assessment of their major is, because they have a statistically much greater likelihood of actually just being very nerdy math students or very nerdy business students than they do being an inevitably nerdy math student, right? So paying attention to that base rate, paying attention to the world around us and going, okay, well, statistically speaking, what's most likely here is a critical part of Bayesian thinking. So that comes up in intelligence analysis all the time. Often we'll find a piece of information that's so compelling. Like, oh, this is the thing, man. This is the thing that unlocks it. But then when you put it in context and you put it against the base rate of how often something like that happens, suddenly it starts to fall away pretty quickly. All right, third skill, balancing verbal and visual thinking. So we were talking about structure and intuition. Language is structured. Visual language is very intuitive, right? And so figuring out how to do both is very important. If we're only working in a textual context, if we're only ever writing things, there's a whole parts of our brains that are not really getting access to, we're not using to solve the problem. So there's a lot of different solutions to this. I generally don't recommend software all that often because there's so much of it out there for this. But one piece of software that I really like is called Obsidian. Does anybody know Obsidian? Obsidian's rad. It's a really great piece of software. The thing that I love about Obsidian is that it allows you to write verbally and then see visually, right? And turn your verbal reasoning into visual reasoning. So it has these things called backlinks. You can see what backlink here, and then little pieces of them. Really easy to put into your text, and then suddenly those backlinks relate to each other. You can start to draw graphs of how these different ideas and concepts relate to each other. Really, really powerful for open source intelligence. And particularly, I'd recommend this. My OSINT training has a OSINT documentation with Obsidian. It's fantastic. Really, really, really good course. It's like $100. If you want to learn how to do OSINT, it's a good course. If you want to learn how to use Obsidian, it's a really good course. And it's taught, if you can believe it, by another middle-aged, bald dude named Micah. So we're a club. He gets this one. Yeah, but there's this. I mean, OSINTers tend not to have a lot of hair. We're worriers. So the base rate of Micahs is pretty low, though you will find, if you did a little bit of OSINT on me, that there's an astonishing number of Micah Clarks. When I do OSINT training, I use myself basically as a target for my students, and I'm always surprised how much stuff is out there. Not just about me, but about every Micah Clark in the world. There's a lot of athletes that are Micah Clark. Who knew? So there you go. Not all of them are bald. Okay, so wrapping up this section, and then we'll get into some stuff that's a bit more practical. Structure and intuition, fine balance, right? So no OSINTer is an island. Getting system twos together, getting people together and working on a project together will go dramatically faster and better. Exercising tactical patience and letting that mosaic emerge is also really important. We want to jump to conclusions. We want to allow all of our biases to kick in and just get to the solution. And that's often not really possible. Plans are useless. Planning is everything, right? As they say, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. I like to say no plan survives first contact with the internet. But the process of doing planning, the actual activity of doing planning, the thinking that's involved in that is everything. So this is Dwight Eisenhower, the dude that won the Second World War. And then finally, as we just said, externalizing things verbally and visually, very, very important. I know a lot of programming challenges and things like this. Folks that I've seen solve them in the most elegant ways often are very, very visual in their thinking. They're very structural in their thinking, and that can be really helpful. So it's a transferable skill. Okay, last thing. How are we doing on time? Pretty good. Okay. Context sensitivity and the 3 C's. What is context sensitivity? Let's ask poorly drawn lines. It says, do you love living in the ocean? I don't know what that is. It's this, everything around you, the creatures and the plants and all the water. All the what? It's being aware of the things that you're in, right? And again, this is information anxiety. We are all awash in information, and we are so desensitized to it in a lot of ways that figuring out how to contextualize information, I would argue, is probably the most valuable skill you can have as a professional in any discipline, but especially in the OSINT world. Context sensitivity, again, is a cognitive science concept, basically that our brains need to set context. We need to be able to establish a clear boundary of what's important and what's not in a particular sort of situation in order to establish what's relevant and what's important in that situation. So philosophers call this bracketing, right? We put a bracket around it, we look through the brackets, everything else needs to fade away. But you can't really know what's relevant, what's significant, unless you know what you're looking for in the first place. So context sensitivity is that characteristic that our brains has. Difficulty is the internet is a big, messy, unstructured place. It's a place that is largely devoid of context. You can find lots of layers of context. I'm going to talk about how you do that here in just a second. But new evidence adds new context, which is the most important thing, and more context points to new evidence. This is this virtuous cycle that you go through. Remember I mentioned Hans-Georg Gadamer, my favorite German? He has this thing called the hermeneutic cycle. Hermeneutics is just interpretation. And he talks about the hermeneutic circle as the relationship between the particular and a whole. So he uses a poem as a good example. He says, as we interpret individual lines of a poem, our sense of the poem as a whole begins to change. And so as our sense of the poem as a whole changes, so might our understanding of individual lines, right? So those two things happen together. The context is that whole, right? We're looking for this whole, and we're saying, okay, well, this is roughly the boundaries around which or within which I actually need to find the thing that I'm looking for. Give you another example. Anybody have seen Spotlight? It's a movie from maybe 15 years ago. Yeah, anyway, it's about, yeah, there's one person. You have to be of a certain age. Some of you probably weren't even really around for the events that are described in Spotlight. But basically, Spotlight is a movie about the investigative journalist who broke the priest sexual abuse scandal in the US, in Boston. And this is the first big break in the sexual abuse scandal that then ultimately spread all around the world. And we're still living with the legacy of this, all the insane things that have happened as a result. They were a team called Spotlight at the Boston Globe. And they got some early evidence from a few people who claimed that they had been abused by priests. So you had this handful of individuals It's a little hard to see, but they're different colors. The colors represent the priests that abused them. And these people said, okay, doctor or father, whoever abused me. But really, in the grand scheme of things, at that point, with the people that they knew, it was only a handful of priests. But everybody they talked to said, this is a much bigger deal. Like, tons and tons of people have been abused. You guys just need to figure out how to find the priests who did this abusing. So they organized themselves. They got into this, they racked and stacked, as we like to say, the priests that they knew of. They understood something about the context in which that was occurring. But then ultimately, they had the big break. They went to the diocese in Boston. They found these directories. Anybody know what a phone book is? Yeah, it's basically a phone book. It was all the people, this is 2001, all the people, all the staff and everyone in the Catholic organization in Boston. And they discovered an interesting pattern. So they had this handful of priests, and when they went and looked at the directory from the year after these priests had been accused of abuse, they found something interesting. Every time they would be listed as on leave, in medical treatment, something like this. They'd basically been put in the penalty box because they'd abused a child. But then the year after, they go right back into being priests again. They go back into a parish. So what do you suppose they did? They took all those directories and they said, okay, let's find all the people that are on leave, medical treatment, everything. And so they basically created a target set. Does that mean that all of those priests were guilty of sexual assault? Of course not. But what it did is it created a context. It created a subset that they could then look inside of and try to develop information. In the end, they identified over the space of 2 years, they published 800 stories, 150 priests just in Boston were charged with crimes. And ultimately, it spread around the world. Any number of Catholic organizations have had to declare bankruptcy because they've been sued so many times. Right? So there's a really valuable skill, this process of combining tactical patience, establishing context, finding patterns. This is really the heart of OSINT. Okay, so strategies for building that context. One thing that's really important, I've been talking a lot about structure and being really disciplined and rigorous and strict about how you do a lot of these things. There's a lot of value in saying, for the next half an hour, I'm just gonna go Google some stuff. I'm gonna go poke around, I'm gonna go marinate in the context, I'm just gonna go find information, I'm gonna learn about it, I'm gonna build up a basic understanding of this context so that I can more clearly and with more discipline put some structure around it. There are frameworks you can use to do that. So the STEEP framework and the STIMPLES framework, they're acronyms for like social, technological, economic, environmental, and political, I think is what it is. So there's different frameworks you can get yourself organized. It's another way of doing it. One of my more recent and preferred methods is just to spend some time with generative AI. Maybe you don't have any other system 2 hanging around that you can go talk to. Well, AI is not a bad stand-in for a system 2. So just as an example, I said, I'm a senior intelligence analyst. This is not true. I just made it up. I'm a senior intelligence analyst. I've been tasked to forecast how Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which HTS is the insurgent organization that took over Syria after Assad left. I want to know how they're going to evolve over the next 6 months, provide me with context and background I'll need to start doing the research, and provide the sources. Really practical. The extraordinary thing is, as a user experience designer and as an interface designer, that I've noticed using ChatGPT and a lot of these other ones is just how much time they've spent figuring out how to use bullets, headings, structure, right? Visual reasoning to help you move through the responses. Pay attention to that, actually. Often you can learn a lot more about the information that's being provided through a response to a prompt just by looking at how it's structured. Like, don't even read the words. Like, let your eyes blur and look at the structure. It will tell you a lot about what it's actually going to feed you. But this was pretty extraordinary. It worked out beautifully in this particular case. So consider using generative AI. Again, I tend to be pretty cautious around how I use it in a professional context for OSINT because the stakes are pretty high. But it is really useful. Speaking of tools, this is where we shift to the very practical things. Context is really, really important when you actually start doing search work, right? So we're at the point in our conversation where we've spent time kind of marinating in the source material. We're starting to build this context. Now we need to start doing much more targeted search work. Context is everything in this context because every single tool that you use is going to have its own way of trying to find the thing that you need. So Marshall McLuhan, again, some nice Canadian, says, you know, we shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us, right? There's this dynamic that we end up having. And so if you're not clear on what your search intent is, the tool can't be clear on it either. More often than not, the tool is going to say, okay, well, this is how I want to do it. And it's going to change your basic intent. It's going to change your knowledge goal for you. So you got to get really clear on context. Interesting thing is that every search that you run, this takes a second, it's a bit of a brain blur. Every search that we run is a prediction. So if you go to Google, you type in some search queries or some search language, without really realizing it in the back of your head, you're actually predicting what that search query is going to return, right? Like we're thinking about that. If I put it in this way, probably isn't going to work. My ideal result would probably look something like this, right? So we're going through this process very quietly, kind of subconsciously with our system one, trying to figure out what to put in there. It can get messy and ugly and hilarious sometimes, but it is fundamentally a prediction. And if you think about that, then you have these two tracks happening. You have your brain and you have the interaction with the tool. So this is getting into my UX stuff. We build this mental model of what we think we're going to get, and then we apply that into a tool. We have the search syntax that we use. We evaluate the results that we get against what we expected to get. Then we update it, we change it, go through this sort of Bayesian process of figuring it out, iterate over and over again, and we start to get closer and closer to the target. In the tool context, first we have to orient ourselves to what the heck the tool does. And again, this is why I do what I do. Most of these tools are very bad at explaining how they do, and how you actually run a search. Building and executing the search, comparing it to what you expected, planning updates and iterating, right? These two things work together. That interaction is really critical. But we can only really evaluate the accuracy of the prediction that we've got and the performance of what we've done if we have a structured understanding of what we were set out to do, right? We need to have that basic context before we can jump into that. So here's the 3 C's approach. This is something 2016, 2017. I was running, this is going to be a humble brag, I apologize. I was running this 2-week training program in the US for folks in the special operations community. It was a thing that I developed because I'd gone to a bunch of other trainings that they went to, and I said, these suck. I want to do it myself. So I built a slide deck called Outsmarting the Cool Kids, because they were all these really cool company, and then we outsmarted them. We built our own training program. And I was doing this training program. I had all these tool vendors that were coming in to explain how their tools did what they did and all the fancy, cool things that they did, but none of them could really, really fundamentally explain how to use the tool, right? So like, what's the best practice for how to use your tool? I don't know. I know how to push the buttons. And so I said, okay, well, I'm going to bring a best practice that will work in basically any tool. And I cooked this up. Okay, so the 3 C's, it would be no surprise to you that the first C is context. Context, content, controls. Those are the 3 C's. So this is just a really simple, common sense way to structure your goals and articulate them in a search. You can use it in Google. You can actually, it works really well in ChatGPT or other LLMs as well. It's just a nice, simple way. It keeps you in control of the goals that you have. And it makes it really possible to use almost any tool strategically. So let's apply it to OSINT. So context, content, controls. Okay. Context. These are the logical boundaries of your search. These are the outer boundaries of your search. This could be the specific source that you want to look at. I only want to look at LinkedIn, maybe, which is actually really helpful for OSINT. Concepts, organizations, locations often are really, really good. When we think about context, we often think about geographic context. So that can be a really good way of doing it. Second is content. These are the things you actually want to find. So this is names, terms and phrases, topics, you name it. And then controls are the refinements and limits that you put on that. Usually you don't apply controls until you've already run a search with content and context and content. But this is often things where you're just trying to get rid of things. Maybe something in your search, the way you wrote it, like a combination of 2 search terms, triggers some other thing that's completely irrelevant. So let me give you an example. 10 years ago, Al-Shabaab, this terrorist group in Somalia, attacked a mall in Kenya. They broke in, and not only did they go in and start killing people, they started live streaming it. It was bonkers. The mall in Nairobi was called Westgate. So here we are trying to get collect on Westgate Mall and a terrorist attack, and I literally live across the street from Westgate Mall in Ottawa, right? So one of the controls that's pretty important is to exclude all of the other Westgate malls that could be coming up in my results, to be very, very clear that I only want the one in Kenya, just as one basic example. Okay, let's make this visual. Context. It's the outer boundary of the concept. Generally, if it doesn't include these terms, if it doesn't include some characteristic of this, it's probably not relevant to this particular part of my project. Content then fits inside of that. So it's my core information goals. If it contains these words, it probably is relevant, right? So I have a guarantee that if it doesn't contain this, it's probably not relevant. If it does contain this, it is definitely relevant. And then controls really is a quality of life thing. This is just a way to clean it up. If I exclude this parameter or something like that, my life's just going to get better. And so your search ultimately is the combination of all these things. It's over in this content piece. It's the part of the context that contains your content. What does that even look like? Well, it could just be search terms, and I'll explain how to do that in search terms. But it literally, when you interact with the tool, you'll notice how all of these things work. This is actually a design concept if you really think about it. So there's your context, right? For D&B Hoovers, which is like a public records thing for companies, you can pick a specific part of their database to search, and that's your context. You've set a context. You've said, this is the boundary. I don't care about all that other stuff, just this thing. And then secondly, you then put in your content in the search bar, right? You've got those two components are working together. You've got the big one down to the little one. Another one, this is EchoSec. This is a tool I used to work with. You can set the parameters in this location for a particular location. In Florida, maybe, they have 51 different data sources. You can do the drop down and pick the ones that you want to search, but you can federate a search across all of them if you want to. But then you have the content. You can actually pick, in their case, they have pre-built sort of search term databases. So maybe you pick the trafficking database, and it includes all these search terms, including a bunch of others. Or, and this is pretty slick, actually, they have a object recognition as well. So I want to look for all these words, but I also want to find anything that has an object related to drugs in it. So now you have, I want to look in Florida against 51 data sources for anything related to these trafficking terms, or things that might include drugs in a picture, which is a good way of doing it. You've combined those two things, your funnel just got a lot smaller, right? So you're looking at a relatively small piece of information. Google is a great example, right? Google's obvious. Context, we often miss this, but they give you the context cue right there. Just pick your context if you want to. Just look at news and then not look at everything else. And you can also just do this with actual text. So let's say your context, in this case, let's say the intelligence requirement is to learn something more about, and this is a completely anonymized case, but someone named Zhang Wei who runs a company called Megatronic Company Limited. You're trying to understand what's up with this company, where do they get their funding from, things like this. So perhaps you could go to the English version of the BIT Chinese university website and set that as your context. I only want to look at this website. I've taken the entirety of Google and I've said, just look at the website, nothing else. And I want to look for Zhang Wei and Megatronic. I don't want Zhang Wei by herself because there might be a lot of people named Zhang Wei. I want Zhang Wei and Megatronic, but I don't want medical equipment. I don't want anything related to this because it turns out there's also some false positives that come up when I do this. So there you go, context, content control. Powerful, very, very quick. You can start to modify that a little bit, so you can complicate it a little bit. We haven't talked about George Boole, but Boolean logic, which you guys have all heard about, it's just math, basically. Starting to use parentheses, brackets, using quotations, particularly in Google, for what it's worth. Quotations mean exact match, but they also mean must be included. So if you've ever gone to Google and you put in a search and it says there aren't enough results or aren't any results for the way that you did it, but if you want to ensure that this particular term is included, you can click must include whatever, and it'll put it in quotes, because actually that's a way of telling Google, don't give me any results unless they contain this exact phrase. It's a very powerful way to be very bossy with Google. And also with Google, if you want to exclude something, it's actually a negative sign, which is kind of convenient. It's a lot easier. Anybody familiar with some of these little Can you hear me now? Okay. So file type's fantastic one. The crazy thing, if you really stop and think about it, for example, XLS, file type XLS is a fantastic advanced operator because you're actually looking inside of Excel files. You can use it for, I think you can use it for JSON objects. You can use it for like geographic data. It's extraordinary. So if there's one very practical thing that you haven't learned before, you learn tonight, it's those advanced operators. Just quite literally Google advanced operators, and you'll find a big list of them. They're very, very helpful. But again, really, really critical. Site is a great way to set context. Using file type, a lot of others that are available as well, really helpful. So we've got these different things, these different ways of framing our search and narrowing our search down. I want to emphasize that when you're using controls and you're excluding stuff, be very careful. Use a scalpel, not a hatchet, as they say, because you can very, very rapidly exclude relevant information. In fact, part of the magic of OSINT and part of the magic of doing effective search in general is that you want the irrelevant information in there so that you can see and know that the boundaries of the relevant information are a subset of that, right? So if you only have relevant information, that is cause to be nervous. You should actually change your search, make it a little bit bigger so that you start to see some noise, because once you start to see noise, you can be pretty confident you have all of the relevant information. Easy to get distracted in OSINT. As I mentioned, I'm a gardener. I love growing tomatoes. One of the things that happens with tomatoes is, particularly indeterminate tomatoes, they grow these little things called suckers. They're these little plants, and they're right in the armpit of the plant. And if you leave those on there, and you can, it's not a big deal, but that's not just a branch. That's a whole new plant, right? It has all the energy to create all of the other parts of a plant. So suddenly, if you don't take the suckers off your plant, then you've got dozens of plants coming out of one root. Same thing happens in OSINT. If you don't take off the suckers, if you don't take off the bits that, you know what, actually turns out that was a dead end. I'm just going to stop on that one. I'm going to leave it. I might come back to it, but I'm not going to deal with it anymore. That's a very good way to keep growing rather than getting stuck, because the suckers get bigger and bigger and bigger. So that's another sucker for you. So something careful to keep in mind as you do that. This controlled process of narrowing down your search, tying it very, very closely to your knowledge goals and the context that you need is a critical part of this. Final thing I'll say about this is different people have different preferences around how they consume information, right? We're talking about information behavior. And one of the most common ones that I see a distinction between is people who love to search and people who love to sift. So how many of you on your computer are really obsessive about file structure and keeping things organized? Yeah, you are sifters, right? You are people that like to sift through the bits. I am too. I love, oh, my file structure is gorgeous, except when it's not. I do a lot of searching. It's kind of my job, but I don't really like to do it because I kind of know where things are. I just want to go to the place where the thing is. That's also very common in OSINT. So some people really can tolerate a lot of noise. They can tolerate kind of searching through stuff and poking around in things and finding it. And other people really need to search much more specifically. So if you're a searcher, if you're the sort of person who goes, I don't really know where this thing is, but here's some characteristics of the thing. I think this is probably what the file name is. Just be very careful not to over-specify, because you will miss things. You'll miss things you didn't expect to find, which is important. Often the things that we don't know that we want to find are the things that we actually need to find. If you're a sifter, don't let that noise distract you from your core goals. It's very, very common. Again, shiny objects is a very big problem in OSINT. There's so much out there, and there's so many opportunities, so many possibilities. But when you're doing this work in a professional context, and that's literally your job, you're being paid to do it, and some very important person on Parliament Hill needs something very, very specific. They need some very clear information from this. You can't really afford to just go and get distracted, and 3 hours later you're watching cat videos, right? It's not really how it works. So what does it actually look like? Just to kind of wrap things up. So professional OSINT, or ProSINT as my hip, cool OSINT friends like to call it. Professional OSINT analysis in 2025 is about stewarding that information system. There's a fine line between doing good OSINT work and doxing people, right? There's a real fine line there. And when you're doxing people, particularly people who can't defend themselves, you're harming the information environment. If you are using really unethical means to get a hold of data, or you're getting a hold of data without the consent of the people that have it, or you're collecting data on selectors that are really invasive on like really sensitive topics, you're actually harming the information ecosystem. You're harming that information environment, and it's not going to be there when you need it later. Second, structured intuition samurais, right? There's this kind of perfect balance that you can strike between being very, very rigorous and being very, very creative. That's kind of the magic of all of this. Thirdly, good at finding evidence, but really about making meaning. That's the magic of OSINT as well, and intelligence more broadly. It's really cool to figure out where the picture of that squirrel picking its nose is in Lithuania. I mean, I'm all for it if that's what you want to spend your time doing, but is that going to help anyone make a decision? Well, probably not. So getting past just finding the evidence, getting past just the facts and getting to meaning is a critical part of this whole thing. And then finally, it's really fundamentally, I think the most important part is that OSINT for way too long, and intelligence broadly, but OSINT in particular, for way too long has had this kind of antagonistic relationship with the public. Like, we play to the edge, right? Like, we're tough guys. We jump out of helicopters and kill people. So like, that means that we can do weird stuff on the internet and nobody's gonna tell us no. But that's not how it's gonna work, right? We need to have public trust in order to do this work. I've become more and more activist about privacy over the years because I've seen so many people do so many stupid things with open source intelligence, to realize that this is a fun game we're doing, but it's not gonna last if we keep doing that. So to just close with a couple of key questions that are more or less relevant to you, you can cross-apply them to how it would work for you. But as an OSINT practitioner, what's my professional commitment to guarding public trust? How am I making sure that in the process of doing my work, I'm not actually degrading the very people that I'm trying to protect? What practices am I using to responsibly empower my intuition? This isn't OSINT specific. This is just life specific, right? What kinds of things am I doing to create enough structure around the tasks that I'm doing to allow my intuition and my creativity to just run wild, right? That's the magic of, I keep saying magic, but it really is magic. That's the important part about context. It's the important part about structure, is that if you can set those outer boundaries, then you can go play inside of them and let yourself do them. If you don't set those boundaries, then every single decision you're trying to make, you're wondering, is this okay? Is this still relevant? Am I allowed to do this? That's the information anxiety. You don't want the information anxiety. Right, and then finally, how am I building context and literacy to improve the credibility of my work? As students, perhaps, this is very important to you, but as intelligence professionals, this is really the heart of the entire profession, is improving accuracy and efficiency and credibility. But really that rests with this question of context. It rests with figuring out the part of that huge pile of data that actually matters, right? Paying attention to it and saying, oh, this is the water that I need. This is the hay that I need. This is the part of it that's actually relevant. Now I can go and dig in. So there you go. Thank you very much. Please stay in touch. That's my website. That's my email. If I was a smarter person, I would have bought cards, but I didn't. So take a picture. And thank you. I'd love to chat. So awesome.
Micah, thank you.
No problem.
For the folks on the internet, you're not going to hear me when I say the next part, but you can repeat my question. Oh, look, we're going to share. We're going to share. Once again, Micah Clark, that was incredible. Thank you. Questions. That was a lot. I have so many, but I want to see from the floor or from the internet, what questions have we percolated over the last 40 minutes or so? Internet?
Any course or resource recommendation to properly learn how to maximize the search function?
How would you recommend to learn about maximizing the search function in Google? You can't say Google it.
Okay, I won't say Google it, but I will say, if you really want to dig in and you really want to get into not just the advanced operators, but how to use advanced operators together, generally it's referred to as Google dorking. Strange thing to call it, but anyway, that's what you want to go looking for. You want to look for Google Dork courses. You want to go look for Google Dork websites. There's a ton of them. You can do some really wild stuff with advanced search operators. You can do things where you take parts of URLs, for example, that are common in certain devices and search in URL for that. And you can find open webcams and all sorts of completely irresponsible things. But you can also do a lot of really practical stuff. I find just good advanced search operators, especially setting context to certain websites, is super powerful, because Google is going to give you everything on the internet. But if you only need that one part of it, the site operator in particular is really helpful. So I don't know of a particular course, but there's a ton out there. Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious because you mentioned that you prefer collaborative over individual ones.
Yeah.
Is there like an ideal size of people for you? Because I feel like if it's like too many, then
yeah. Two works pretty well. Yeah. Oh, the question was, is there an ideal sort of group size for doing this kind of work? 2 works really well. 3 works terribly in any context. Don't ever be in a group of 3, because there's always one person that gets left out. So it doesn't work really very well. I like round numbers. 4 is pretty good. Sounds bizarre. It depends on what you're doing as well. I find, for example, war story. So 2014, I was working at an open source intelligence company here in Ottawa. This October 2014 terrorist attack on Parliament Hill. My boss runs out of his office and goes, do something, and then just like leaves because his kid was at Elgin Public School and he just wanted to go get his kid. So we spent the entire day trying to figure out how to respond to this. And we basically said, okay, aces in their places, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. And we found all these kind of emergent process of group dynamics. One of them that we overlooked at first but became really important is just having a scribe, what we called them. It's like your job, you're not actually doing the work. You're just recording all of the things that we're doing. Like you're sitting down and all the decisions that we're making out loud to each other, you're recording them, you're recording a timestamp, all this kind of stuff, so that we can roll back the tape and go, how did we end up here? Like, how did we come to that conclusion? So that's one example. I like to, in the intelligence world, from a professional discipline distinction, often you'll have a distinction between collectors and analysts, which can be helpful, particularly if you're in a like time compressed situation. Some people are just better at finding information. Other people tend to be better at making sense of it. So that's a nice distinction. But there's no perfect size, just not 3. Yeah. Don't go on a camping trip with 3 people. That's a bad idea. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so there's a few out there. The one thing I will caution, well, you're kind of in a rock and a hard place. The question was, are there some good open source tools out there that you can use? You're kind of in a rock and a hard place when it comes to open source intelligence tools, between open source tools and commercial tools. The commercial tools are unbelievably expensive, thousands and thousands of dollars, and a lot of them are really not worth the money, so don't bother. The open source tools can be good, but they break all the time. So that can be really frustrating. A lot of open source intelligence practitioners spend seemingly all of their time just finding new tools. There are usually some freemium versions of tools. There's one called Spiderfoot, for example, that I think still has a free version. If you're into the more technically oriented side of it, the community edition of Maltego is good. Anybody ever heard of Maltego? Good cybersecurity tool. They have a lot of plugins for OSINT. Tend to involve a little bit of money to get the plugins and the transforms, but it can be done. Yeah, and what you'll also find is that often people will list as a tool a lot of these sort of databases of other tools. So it's kind of one of these things where you just get lists and lists and lists. So go find some key lists. There's one called, oh shoot, what's it called? I think it's just called OSINT Framework, actually. And it's a great source of tools. And it's built in this really nice graph format. So you maybe find a country or a topic, like you want to do like IP and DNS work, and you can go in there and it'll have a list of tools. Just know that because things change, some of the times the tools break. But yeah, it's available. Yeah. Cool.
Another from the internet?
Ah.
So another question from the internet. In the context of searching OSINT about a person, what do you consider fair OSINT? If it's behind a login wall, is it OSINT or not?
Yeah. So the question is, what's fair game when you're, for example, looking for a person or for people's information? If it's behind a login, is it still fair game? Is it still considered open source? 5 years ago, I would have told you, well, if it's behind a login, it's probably not publicly available because you have to be someone in particular to see it. So you're not Joe Public, you're Doug Jones or whatever your name is. So if you're in government, it's a little bit tricky to do that. You might have special authorities that allow you to, but it's a little tricky. Now, because of the way that particularly social media, but a lot of other sites have gone, the monetization structures of these sites require them to build logins. So, and to have an account. So Twitter used to be completely public. Well, it's not anymore. You actually have to have a username just to even get in there. Thankfully, your Twitter username doesn't have to be anyone in particular, so it can be kind of vague. But because logins are now kind of just a part of almost any site, that's no longer a useful distinction in open source, which causes no end of consternation in government, believe me, because I'm working with a lot of different departments to figure out the appropriate balance there. Think about logins now more as like a ticket to a concert, right? No one would go to a concert and assume that it's a private space unless it's like 5 people. But you still have to buy a ticket. And often I think with logins, that's more the way you need to think about it. So the short answer is, yeah, you can use logins to get into things. That the reality is, and this is a big part of open source, is that whether it's a tool or it's a user account that you've created, you're creating the potential for harm, you're creating the potential for misuse, and it's now your job to figure out how to use that appropriately. So logins are just another tool of the trade. Not using them means that you're going to be safe, which is fine, but using them is going to mean that you're effective, but also a bit dangerous. What's appropriate is going to depend a lot on situational sort of factors for a particular case. You could make an argument that someone who potentially, and this is a lot of where I end up working, someone who is uttering threats or is, constitutes some sort of threat has kind of sacrificed a bit of their personal privacy in the process of doing that. And so perhaps you can be a bit more aggressive about that. Someone who's a potential business partner or your neighbor or something like that has not done anything to motivate your work. And so I think they deserve a lot more dignity and restraint. But there's shades of gray in between those things. The truth is, like I said earlier, it's not just about the cut and dry, it's about the judgment. And you have to bring a lot of judgment to that, what's fair and what's not. I think also the place where, I know we're not a government audience, but one of the places, for what it's worth, where government gets very, very nervous isn't so much what you've collected and how you've analyzed it, but how are you communicating that to other people? Are you giving that to third parties? Are you disclosing that personal information to people? And under what context, what kind of protections do they have, that sort of stuff. So don't just think about what you can find, but also what are you then going to do with it? That's one of the issues that I often have with public OSINT practitioners who, they find a political movement that they don't like and they go and they dox them. I mean, that happened a lot with the convoy and stuff like that. And as much fun as that might be, there's a fine line there. And so communicating and posting that stuff publicly, like we were talking about earlier, there's a fine line between doing OSINT and doxing someone. So I've been doxed. Not a pleasant experience. So I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. 0 stars out of 5.
What is doxing?
Doxing is collecting absolutely every piece of information that you can find about someone and compiling it into a dossier, and then choosing to then disclose that to the world and enabling people to get swatted and threatened and all sorts of terrible things, or drawing in maybe perfectly innocent bystanders that are their kids or something like that. It's basically this idea that, well, people put stuff on the internet, and so they have to expect that I'm going to go find all of it and show it to everyone else. Well, again, we were talking about earlier, your expectation of privacy is going to vary a little bit. And so compiling all that information into a dossier, not all that unusual, that happens in the intelligence world all the time. But then taking that information and using it to intimidate people or to threaten them or put them at risk is just a bad idea. That's that really dangerous part of the information ecosystem where you're doing a lot of damage. Yeah.
All right. Do you see a future like when AI can autonomously conduct OSINT?
Yeah. So is there a future where AI just does OSINT, basically? Yeah, probably. Because again, like the factual parts of it, yes. It's already more than capable of doing that. Some of you, I'm sure, read that wonderful Python book, Automate the Boring Stuff. There's a lot of boring stuff in OSINT too, right? And so getting AI to do a lot of automation is a really helpful thing to do. It's a big part. It's kind of the leading edge of the industry right now as well. Completely autonomous. There are folks, I know folks, particularly in the US, in the intelligence community, who would argue that that's possible, potentially. That not just that it can go out and find information, collect it, and sort of aggregate it for you, but can then actually do interpretation and come to conclusions, do detections within data sets, this kind of stuff. It's possible. Is it going to be possible at industrial scale? Probably not. And is it going to be really worth our time? Probably not. But yeah, there's a lot more of it is going to be automated, I think. And autonomous is the right word that you used, yeah.
So to pick up on that, those are two extremes. So like there's two extremes. There's no AI, there's all AI. You touched on it a little bit. We saw some ChatGPT at the talk. Where is the sweet spot for human AI interaction? Concrete example, I, for fun, noticed somebody post something on the internet, on LinkedIn the other day. I was like, that seems really revealing. And it was a picture where they were at a strip mall. You could see the different suite numbers. And out of curiosity, I was like, well, and I asked ChatGPT, where in the US might I find, I didn't give it the suite numbers, I gave it the 3 stores next to each other in that order. And it came back in 3 seconds with 2 possible locations. The first one was exactly it.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary. Give you a completely unrelated example. Some of my tomato plants, my seedlings, are not doing very well. So I took a picture of them and asked ChatGPT what was wrong with them. Turns out I've been overwatering them and they have edema. But it's really impressive. Computer vision is an extraordinary thing. Computer vision is a great place where AI can be super, super helpful for OSINT. I had the weird experience of being involved in a project called Project Maven. Anybody ever heard of Project Maven? Very, very controversial project. It was sort of the Department of Defense in the US's first attempt at using AI, and they were like, why don't we put AI on drones? And everybody's like, that's dangerous. But anyway, we did it anyway. So it was all based on computer vision. It was all based on full motion video, these huge full motion videos of areas, and figuring out how to get AI to be able to tell the difference between a donkey and a guy on a bicycle. And we spent a lot of time doing that, and it was very, very practical. So that's a great place in intelligence where it can be useful. Where's the fine line? I really think of AI as my system too, right? Like as AI is my co-pilot, right? to use that phrase. It's really good to bounce ideas off of. The other place where I would say is really helpful, again, in user experience design, we talk about the distinction between recognition and recall. Anybody know this distinction? So if I asked you, what's the capital of Portugal, you'd have to think a little bit. But if I said, is the capital of Portugal Lisbon? You'd go, oh, yeah, because it's hard to recall things. It's easy to recognize things. So I love using ChatGPT to be like, all right, give me like a 3-paragraph summary of X topic that I know a ton about, but I want to make sure, I want to validate and recognize whether or not I've got all of the information in my head. It's not about plagiarism. It's not about copying it. It's literally recognizing whether I'm on the right track or not. That's a super helpful cognitive trick to use with AI, is just basically ask it things that you know the answers to figure out how it structures and organizes that information. Using it more sort of forensically is totally possible, like you said, in terms of like doing geoguessing and the sort of factual information. Just remember that, and as you said, there's an important restraint there where you're not really giving it a whole lot of information, but everything you produce, like everything you put in there is being used to then retrain the AI. And so you may actually be disclosing things. If you're in a government context where you're having, guarding public trust and you're putting sensitive information into an AI engine, that's a really bad idea. Because it's going to get retrained and it might spit out that same information to somebody you don't want to see it. So, but again, I think it's all about that kind of collaborative aspect right now, beyond any specific technical approach.
Time for about 2 or 3 more questions, and we've got one coming up from the internet.
What half the internet?
Oh, I thought you were looking back there. What forums or groups would you recommend for anyone interested in collaboration?
Yeah. There's a lot of good Slack communities. I know you guys have an OWASP Slack community. There's quite a few of those. Some of the larger NGOs that do OSINT professionally have communities attached to them. So some of you probably heard of Bellingcat, which is a very popular one. There's another one called the Center for Information Resilience. Of all of the people I could recommend that you listen to and pay attention to if you're a lot more interested in OSINT is a guy named Benjamin Strick, who works at CIR, the Center for Information Resilience. There's also the OSINT Open Source Center, which is a new organization based in the UK that is collaboratively oriented, that has a community attached to it. And then the last one I would mention that I really love is, I think it's called OSINT Jobs. Basically, it's just a job aggregator for OSINT, but they're a community of OSINTers, and so there's really, really good community to be built there as well. It's usually in little pockets. You'll find it usually, often. There's definitely Reddit, and there's some Discord servers for sure. I can't name any of them off the top of my head, but there's quite a few.
There's also a group in the UK called OSINT UK.
Yeah, that might be the OSINT UK is like this. It's like a not-for-profit, and they probably would have a Discord server. Yeah. So Discord's good for that kind of thing. And usually, again, Discord's pretty good at community moderation, that kind of stuff. So you're not going to see any kind of weird stuff. One thing I didn't mention that I think is really important to emphasize around OSINT is taking good care of your mental health when you're doing OSINT. Inevitably, if you get into OSINT on anything sensitive whatsoever, you are going to be exposed to harmful content. There's a lot of tricks for avoiding that. A lot of these communities are good at giving you advice in terms of how to manage that mental health, but also sometimes the communities fail to set good boundaries around what people are sharing, and it can get really dark really quickly. I had that experience early in my OSINT career. I saw stuff that I still can't not see. So be very careful in that regard. And community can be really helpful, but also harmful. Yeah.
vigilante,
Mm.
social media-esque OSINT, and if you know, and if anyone knows who's worked for like the government OSINT, it's very rigid, it's very hard rules to follow. It's actually very challenging at times, bureau job in terms of the collection and analyzing of information. So I guess my question is, now that we've seen this kind of rise of this more social media and armchair OSINT person that's kind of less involved in the process, as you call it, like, is there a concern for you that, in the next coming years, the public perception of OSINT might shift in a negative way that makes it a lot harder for government to actually do their jobs effectively? It's kind of the ultimate, serving the public good, right?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. And the question was basically, just for those on the internet, is there a risk that in the space of a few years, some of the, I don't know what the word would be, irresponsible behavior of OSINTers on the internet could actually negatively impact the public's perception of OSINT in government and make it even harder for government to do OSINT? Yeah, for sure. I think it's already happening. I think the more prominent risk is actually not about public perception of the government, which is already pretty poor most of the time. It's actually about the government's perception of what's possible, because they have to live in a pretty tight little box of regulation and authorities, but they can look out and they can see these vigilante OSINTers and crazy people doing crazy things on the internet. And it is admittedly very impressive, some of the things they've done from a tradecraft perspective. And they look at that and go like, why can't I do that, right? And that's a very common thing. And it makes them very frustrated. And so the temptation to push to the edge all the time of that is more prominent, but also the temptation to just fall into more of a fact-based forensic approach to OSINT rather than a more intelligence-led approach to OSINT it's ever present. But yeah, absolutely. Public trust is a huge issue here. I think that the only way that OSINT continues to be sustainable in a country like Canada is if it's happening within really quite strict privacy boundaries. Like, I have no real problem with that. I've worked with departments to figure out where those boundaries are, and there's a lot of good work that can be done within those boundaries. But if we're sort of trying to find if we've created a relationship between people in intelligence and sort of like the public's privacy, and it's an antagonistic relationship, it's just not going to work. It's just not going to work, and it's going to become just that much harder to do the work. Yeah.
One more question.
How do you organize your file storage? What hardware do you use? NAS or whatever?
Yeah. So there's different ways. I'm mostly security-led in terms of my approach to how I organize my setup. So there's a pretty good suite of tools available for secure browsing now that are kind of more or less designed specifically to help people to operate in a non-attributed environment. So usually they're virtual machine based. You just fire up the virtual machine and it's just a browser within a virtual machine. But the sort of throughput that they have set up for that is quite high. So you can watch videos and stuff like this and change proxies. Like if you want to look like you're coming from Brazil, you can just pop over to Brazil. Sometimes it's really important analytically, but sometimes it's important for security reasons as well. In terms of file organization and structure, actual download and saving, it's really pretty traditional approach to it. I think more often than not, if you're doing particularly sensitive stuff, doing it all in a VM is the better approach than using it on actual bare metal. But if you're doing a lot of stuff, period, you should probably use a separate machine. So particularly in government, it's very common to have research stations that the only thing this gets used for is sort of internet research, and then it gets imaged, pretty frequently. And even if you're using a secure browsing environment inside of that, and the bare metal should be protected, you're still imaging it over and over again. It's really important. There's a lot of really good tools that automate the process of evidence collection for OSINT and allow you to store it in a lot of different ways, cloud-based, locally, whatever. Hunchly, and weirdly, they're both Canadian. Hunchly is one of them, hunch.ly. Fantastic tool. You basically turn it on and it just records everything, downloads everything that you're looking at. The other one's called Forensic OSINT. It's built by a government person who basically needed to collect data at the level that can be defended in court, so to a very high evidentiary standard. But that one's highly configurable. You can store the data kind of wherever you need to. But yeah, more often than not, my approach is security first and then information architecture for me. How do I organize it just in terms of, I'm much more of a sifter. So how do I organize this in a way that I'm going to remember what the hell I was doing in the first place, but also that I can easily, quickly find things within that if I need to. So does that answer your question in broad terms? Okay, super.
I guess you're using Obsidian for them too.
Yeah, I use Obsidian to do a lot of sense making and thinking and stuff like that, and it's fantastic. Yeah. Cool. Here you go.
Micah Clark. Well, thank you so much, Micah, and thank you so much, everybody. This seems like a fantastic opportunity to plug the OWASP Ottawa OSINT workshop, which hasn't been organized exactly yet. So if you'd like to participate in the OWASP Ottawa OSINT workshop, if you'd like to volunteer, if you'd like to contribute, that is something that we've been talking about for a few months now. So find us in our own Slack community, and you can find that with the links at owasp.org/Ottawa. We'll see you here the third Wednesday of next month for another fantastic meetup, some pizza, and some great community. Thank you so much. I feel like I'm being told to say one more thing. We'll do one more thank you to our food providers. So Rewind for the pizza. And then as far as our space, the University of Ottawa, the IBM Cyber Range upstairs, fantastic support here for the OWASP Ottawa meetup. We'll see you in a month's time.